Good morning, everyone. We're starting this week's the portion of Acharei Mot and Kedoshim. In those two portions, there are many, many commandments, and they together, between the two portions, are 59 commandments. We're starting from selections from Likutei Sichos, the second talk of the Rebbe on Acharei. In this week's Torah portion, we read in chapter 18, verse 5, the God says, "These are guard my mitzvot and follow them, so that a person may live by them." V'chai Bahem. The Gemara says, how do we know that Pikuach Nefesh is pushing off Shabbat? It removes the Shabbat obligation to keep Shabbat from this week's Torah portion. The Gemara goes through many, many answers, and the Gemara disproves those answers until finally the Gemara comes with the final one. In other words, if someone is going to keep Shabbos and he's not going to live, he's going to die, he needs to violate Shabbat. Minayin lepikuach nefesh dochesh Shabbat, that pushes off Shabbat, asher yaseh otam adam v'chai bahem, that a person may follow the commandments and live by them. Ask the Rebbe few questions. We're going to discuss three of the questions. Question number one, this commandment in this week's portion is not given about Shabbat. It was given in general, as the Gemara uses it, not just for Shabbat. Why is the Gemara in Yuma says that this is where you see by Shabbat that you violate Shabbat to save a life? What happens if someone is not, he keeps kosher, he will not be able to survive. Someone who wants to protect himself from getting shot at and he's entering an idol worship institution which is forbidden by the Torah. The Torah law of V'chai Bahem, he should live by them, and therefore commandments should not prevent someone from saving his life or should not cause someone to die, is not unique to Shabbat. Yet the Gemara says, how do we know that on Shabbat we must violate the Shabbat? From this week's Torah, from this verse, V'chai Bahem. Do you understand the question? Of course, but Shabbat is one of the 613 commandments. Kosher is one of 613 commandments. Idol worship is one of the 613 commandments. By the way, idolatry and adultery and murder, we're not allowed to violate to save a life. But other than those, every other commandment we must violate to save. In what way Shabbat is unique? Where the Gemara says, how do you know that on Shabbat you have to violate Shabbat to save a life? From this week's Torah portion. I know the same thing about kosher, and I know the same thing about Passover and Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur, if the doctor says if you don't give him drink, he will die, we have to violate Yom Kippur. Well, we know it from this week's Torah portion, chapter 18, verse 5. Asher yaseh otam adam v'chai bahem. All the commandments were given for the purpose of living. And the person who followed them and will die is not serving God. So why the Gemara is trying to find an allowance for Shabbat, which is unique from all other commandments? That's the first question. Second question, the Rebbe says, you find the Gemara itself using this verse for other commandments as well, for all the commandments in the Torah with the three exceptions. Why suddenly here we are told about Shabbat uniquely? Number three, Rambam has the same exact issue. Rambam, Maimonides, who quotes Jewish law, brings the idea of violating God's commandments to save a life in two places. And the same thing, says the Rebbe, I don't understand it. In the first place, he brings it in Yesodei Torah, the foundation of Jewish law. Right at the start of his books, he writes that the Torah commandments are there to add to our life. What happens if the Torah commands is causing someone to die? The Torah laws are pushed away for the sake of saving a life. That makes sense. In other words, it's a general rule that applies to all the commandments. Later on, he brings, regarding Shabbat, by Shabbat, he repeats the same thing in the same source of this week's Torah portion. He says on Shabbat, we keep the Shabbat only if it does not cause someone to die. What if someone is not well, or a building fell upon them, and we are not sure if they are alive or not? We must violate Shabbat law, bring heavy equipments, remove all the debris and the whatever is fallen to try and save a life. Why? Because the Torah was given to us to bring peace and life and harmony, and not to cause someone to lose their life. And therefore, we must violate Shabbat. Says Rabbi, I don't understand. This rule apply regarding kosher. This rule apply regarding tithe. If someone, the doctor says he must eat this, and this is from a fruit of a tree that is not 3 years old yet, he has to violate the law and eat from that tree. That's why medication, when it's a life-threatening situation, we violate kashrut law. Kashrut is only one of the commandments. There are many other commandments that are pushed away to save a life. As Rambam right at the beginning, why does he choose that on Shabbat he brings it again? What's so unique about it? It doesn't say it about holidays. It doesn't say it about Yom Kippur. It doesn't say it about other commandments. Why is it that Shabbat is singled out? That's what the Rebbe wants to understand. And the Rebbe says, perhaps we can explain the following. Here is the way the Rebbe explains. When I tell you that saving a life, Pikuach Nefesh, pushes off all the commandments, it may sound to be that you have an obligation to pray. But if you pray, someone is going to die. Therefore, you do not pray, and you help someone survive. In other words, the mitzvah is being pushed off. Why is the mitzvah being pushed off? Because God said, save a life. So I have to keep kosher, but because keeping kosher will cause the person to die, I cannot keep kosher now. So I have to save a life. That's the way when it is speaking about all the commandments. Regarding Shabbat, it's different. Regarding Shabbat, you do not push away the Shabbat law to save a life, but you are saving a life by performing a mitzvah, and therefore Shabbat does not exist. And the Rebbe says, let me prove how we see it. In other words, when it comes to Shabbat, it is unique in the way we save a life, by saving a life, that the mitzvah of Shabbat is not getting pushed off, but is completely canceled. Why is it canceled? Because when it comes to saving a life, God says there is no Shabbat. God does not say there is no kosher when it comes to saving a life. God says save a life is more important. So you have two: saving a life, keeping kosher, and God says save a life. But you're going to lose the keeping kosher mitzvah. By Shabbat, they are not competing against each other. God says, you keep my Shabbat only when it improves life, only when you are able to live a normal life. What happens if someone is not well? Then Shabbat was not given to that Jew. It was not given to that person. Why? Because saving a life is a condition in the keeping of Shabbat. Keeping of Shabbat is only when the keeping of the Shabbat does not threaten the life of someone. Did you understand the distinction? Huh? Yeah. Okay. Says the Rebbe, therefore, that's why Rambam writes that by Shabbat, when someone is not well, Shabbat I kechol lechole. Chol is a weekday. Rambam writes by Shabbat differently than he writes about the other commandments, even though it comes from this week's Torah portion, that when it comes to Shabbat, Shabbat becomes a weekday. That's what Rambam writes. In other words, says the Rabbi, what Rambam intends to say here, what Rambam is hinting to, that when it comes to Shabbat, you're not competing against Shabbat. Shabbat is not given to someone whose life is threatened. Shabbat becomes a Thursday, a Friday morning, a Wednesday, and therefore saving the life of that person does not constitute violating Shabbat, which you have no choice, you have to violate. There's no violation of Shabbat. There is no such thing as Shabbat. It's like if God says, I'm giving this commandment only to a kohen. I'm giving this mitzvah only to a firstborn. I'm giving this mitzvah only to someone who's healthy. Someone who's not healthy, there is no such mitzvah as keeping Shabbat. Did you understand that? That explains few things, but among them one thing, Rambam writes regarding the Shabbat violation when it comes to Pikuach Nefesh, saving a life. Rambam writes the Hebrew word asur leitma'ameha. You are not allowed to delay taken care. In other words, it doesn't say it about other commandments that are removed from because of Pikuach Nefesh. In other words, and the commentators ask, where did the Rambam find it? Asur litmamer, not allowed to delay. In other words, when it comes to Shabbat, someone is not well. The doctor ordered that he has to have a meal, a soup. The soup will make him alive. Otherwise, he'll die. You have to cook on Shabbat. You go and chop wood and you cook for Shabbat for that person. But Rambam writes more than that. Not only we must provide the need for that person, but asur, forbidden, litma'ameh, to take our time. You must do it at once. When it comes to other commandments that are being violated to save a life, there is no such thing as asur litma'ameh. You violate them because you have Pikuach Nefesh, saving a life. You have a mitzvah of Orlah or sabbatical, this is sabbatical year, or Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah, and saving a life is more important, so you save a life. But it doesn't say you have to do it right away, at once, only regarding Shabbat. Says the Rebbe, because on Shabbat, God had the relationship between someone whose life is threatened and the law is there is no competition. God did not give the commandments of keeping Shabbat by a situation when someone is not well. And that, says the Rebbe, and the reason for that, perhaps, because regarding Shabbat, we say it in prayer, and it's in the Torah, Ki ot hi beini uveinechem. Why God gave us a Shabbat? Ot means a sign, because it is a sign of a covenant between you and me, right? If you read about Shabbat prayer and Shabbat Kiddush, Veshamru bnei Israel et ha-Shabbat, לעשות את השבת לדורותם, let the Jewish people keep the Shabbat, guard the Shabbat, because it's a sign, כי אות היא ביני וביניכם. It's a sign of a covenant. That's why a goy, a non-Jew who observes Shabbat, chayav mitah. He's deserving to be executed because he's acting with a covenant that was not given to him. So therefore, Shabbat is unique by creating a sign, a covenant between us. If Shabbat will cause someone to die, you're violating that covenant between us and God, because that man cannot prove that there is a covenant between us and God. Next week, he won't be able to keep Shabbat. There is no sign. Therefore, the best way to have a covenant, to prove there is a covenant between a Jew and God, is when a person keeps Shabbat. And this Shabbat, how is he going to keep Shabbat? By violating the Shabbat laws. When he keeps Shabbat law, when he violates the Shabbat law or he disobeys Shabbat laws, he's going to survive so he can keep Shabbat just by being around. What if he kept all the laws of Shabbat? He will die. If he dies, there is no covenant. You can't show there is a covenant between. A sign of a covenant between us and God does not apply when it comes to kosher, or when it applies to another holiday, Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah. There is no sign. It's an obligation to serve God. Shabbat, we are obligated to do or refrain from doing something just because it serves as a sign between us and God. Therefore, says the Rebbe, Shabbat is demanding that we violate for a life-threatening situation, because that's how we fulfill the reason for Shabbat. Shabbat is given as a sign. The sign will be fulfilled in this person only when the Shabbat law is violated. That explains another question the Rebbe says that commentators ask. And it's amazing how the Rebbe makes the question go away. Commentators ask, I understand that the person is himself whose life threatened should violate any commandment. But where do I know that another person is allowed to assist in violating the Shabbat law? In other words, the Torah says, violate the Shabbat so you may keep many other Shabbats that you live, as in this week's Torah portion, V'chai Bahem, you shall live. So I understand if I'm under a danger, the doctor says, not me, to a person, either you get operated, or you eat the food, or you're not going to survive. And the person goes and cooks on Shabbat for himself to prepare the food, to prepare the medication. I understand. The Torah says you shall live by them and they should not cause you to die. But how do I learn that the doctor performing the operation or me going to cook for that person is allowed? After all, I am violating Shabbat for someone else. Perhaps it shouldn't be allowed. It should be allowed for me to violate my own Shabbat. That's the commentator's question. The Rebbe says there is no question, because what's the purpose of Shabbat? To serve as a sign of a covenant between us and God. When I assist someone to survive, I assist in keeping the sign, keeping the covenant between us and God. Therefore, the same way that that person is Shabbat became a weekday for, the same apply to anyone who is assisting. That's why the Rambam writes, "Ve'asur leitma'ameh." No one is allowed to take their time, because that's how you keep Shabbat to the highest level. Saving someone's life, not my life, but someone else's life, assist in the creating a bigger covenant between God and the Jewish people. And therefore, I have to do it at once. I'm not allowed to delay. I'm not allowed to put it on the list and come whenever the time arrives, but I have to do it right away.
If you have 4 people chopping wood, put them in a fire, all 4 of them are pardoned.
Not just pardon, all 4 of them? Harry is asking a smart question. Doctor said you have to cook, you have to heat up the house. A lady gave birth on Shabbat, and she is bleeding, and there is a dangerous situation. And the doctor comes and says, if the house is not heated up now, the mother, God forbid, can lose her life. A minion heard that. A minion of people who came to visit the mother, they all ran to the forest. They started chopping wood. Chopping wood, the Torah tells us someone chopped wood, he was stoned, right? And they all brought, they stockpile, what do you call a measurement of wood in Alaska? A cord, not 1 cord. There were 10 cords. Everyone brought a cord, a lot of chopping. Rambam writes, not only they are not violating Shabbat, they are rewarded and keeping Shabbat to a highest level. Says the Rebbe, now I understand why. The idea of Shabbat is a covenant between me and God. The more Jewish people keeping Shabbat, the greater the covenant. When I assist someone to keep Shabbat, I am serving Shabbat to the greatest level. Now we can understand why it's singled out. The Gemara asks, how do you know you should violate Shabbat to save a life? Even though the same question is about how do you know you break kosher law to save Shabbat? How do you know you break honoring your father to save a life? How do you know you break Passover and you eat chametz to save a life? But by Shabbat, it's not violating or pushing off the commandment because you have a more important commandment. It is you serving God and serving the Shabbat by keeping the covenant between us and God to a highest level. Therefore, the Gemara is looking for another explanation. Says the Rebbe, now that we understand it's a covenant between us and God, it may apply also to the other commandments. And that's why Rambam, when he writes by Shabbat, Rambam writes, you're not allowed to delay. You have to do it right away. And as I showed now, based on Harry's question, if a bunch of people did the violation, they did a mitzvah, they served God. That's what I have to do quick. And therefore, says the Rebbe, Rambam goes and says, therefore, all the other commandments were given to improve life, and therefore all the commandments are violated, with the 3 exceptions, they are violated to save a life. In other words, once we understand it's because it's a sign between us and God, keeping kosher is also a sign between me and God, the covenant between me and God. On Mount Sinai, we made a covenant with God for every one of the commandments. Honor your father and mother, keep Yom Kippur, keep Passover is also a covenant. However, the specific place where God says the purpose of the mitzvah is a covenant between us and God is Shabbat. That's why the Gemara single out Shabbat. That's why Rambam brings it again on Shabbat. But once we know that that's the reason on Shabbat, that it's not being pushed off, but Shabbat is served to the highest degree because the covenant is going to be kept, now we can apply it for Yom Kippur, for Passover. If the doctor says he has to take this medication that's chametz, that's unleavened, that's leavened, you are allowed, not only allow, you have to keep the covenant. The covenant, keeping Pesach is a covenant between us and God. Therefore, by feeding that person chametz, you are improving that covenant. So you're serving God with that mitzvah albeit it sounds like you're violating the mitzvah and you're doing the exact opposite. And that explains how come everybody else is obligated to assist that person, even though it seems that they are violating the law. But the answer is, by helping that person, they are actually serving God in that regards. Therefore, says the Rebbe, just to summarize, anytime a person assists another person in saving their life, and it's a life-threatening situation, no matter what mitzvah is violated, they not only shouldn't feel bad that they had an opportunity to keep a mitzvah and they had to skip that mitzvah, but quite the opposite. They are serving God to a much higher degree because they are bringing that covenant to a much greater level by causing someone else to keep the covenant and keep serving. Now we have a much deeper understanding, and that's all studied, we all discovered based on the Shabbat rule, ki ot I, because it's a sign. And that's why the Torah says, Ushmartem et mitzvotai, keep all my commandments and guard them and follow them, asher yaseh otam adam v'chai b'hem. So a person should do them and live by them, not just in a simple meaning, and shouldn't die by keeping the mitzvot, but living in a spiritual sense by serving God and keeping the covenant between us and God. And that's the lesson, one of the lessons from this week's. Good Shabbos, everybody.